I am just so drawn to life and like living it. And I just want to fit it all in, and it's overwhelming, you know. I want to go for all of those skis. I want to like get to the top of every peak and like have these really powerful, meaning conversations with friends, with new people to learn. And so I think that just drives me.
Welcome to Season 10, Episode 3 of the Backcountry Podcast. I'm Adam Howard. We recently sat down with Intrepid explorer Lani Bruntz soon after she arrived home from a bikepacking trip in Mexico. Prior to that adventure, she was skiing and guiding in Chile. There's one thing we learned about Bruntz after this interview, it's that she's almost never sitting still. Whether exploring her Crested Butte, Colorado backyard or remote mountain regions around the globe, Bruntz feels most at home in wild places. She came up as a Nordic ski racer before discovering a passion for the more vertical world beyond the groomed track. Today, she's a mountain guide, sponsored athlete, and a professional writer. Her most recent work, entitled Stepping Out, appears in the January issue of Backcountry magazine. The story documents a trip to Alaska where remote terrain and an unforgiving winter environment provided immense challenges at nearly every turn. Like so many who make a life in the backcountry, Bruntz knows firsthand what the mountains can provide and that they can take it away in an instant. She's endured her own personal loss to avalanche. Still, she can't imagine spending her life doing anything else. We'd like to thank Taos Ski Valley for sponsoring this episode and supporting independent media.
There's a place everyone has heard of, but few fully understand. A mountain destination that is committed to protecting its people, place, and planet so that its ecosystem and spirit can be preserved for generations to come. Taos Ski Valley is the world's first and only certified B Corporation ski resort and has earned 100% carbon neutral certification. While preserving their community and the planet is always at the forefront, at Taos, fun is never in the back seat. It is a place where families create cherished memories and groups of friends become family. Taos has the terrain to entertain any type of skier or boarder. Enjoy a winter vacation and feel good about choosing a mountain that values your values. Learn more at skitaos.com.
All right, friends, let's get into it. We hope you enjoy the new episode. Lani Bruntz, welcome to the Backcountry Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So the first thing that comes to my mind is, what is the path that leads a Vail girl to Crested Butte?
Wow. A path I could have never anticipated, and with a lot of U-turns and winds, that's for sure. I left Vail to go to Vermont, where you're from, for college. And at that time, I was a Nordic ski racer. And so I was really drawn to schools that had a NCAA Division I Nordic team, but also like really focused on academics. So I was drawn to Middlebury, moved out there, raced through college, and then was surrounded by very type A, highly driven, motivated, well-educated people who all mostly went on to have, you know, the more classic, successful jobs we might think of, continued their education, went on to, you know, important roles in the world or high-paying jobs, and I did not. I thought I would, and I moved out to Idaho for the summer to raft guide with some girlfriends from college, thinking it'd be just 3 months and I could get all the outdoors things out of my system over those 3 months. And then I'd go to DC to start a job. And yeah, I was supposed to work for the EPA, and I was dragging my feet towards the end of that summer. Had totally developed this whole new passion for the outdoors, for the mountains, that ironically I never had in Vail. In Vail, I had a great childhood, but I just didn't have any real creative draw to the mountains. It was just a place to go out and train for Nordic or be with friends. But beyond that, like, the mountains just didn't captivate me. And everything changed in Idaho. And that's where my whole life path kind of deviated and changed. And from there, I feel like I just started always winging it. And whatever door opened, I'd try to step into. And, you know, some led to, actually, I guess every in its own way led me to where I am now, which it took quite a while. But, 10 years later, I ended up back in Colorado, not far from Vail, but in a town that couldn't be much more different than Vail. That's for sure.
I want to drill down on one of your comments. You're raised in the mountains, and were you there your whole life, essentially, up until college?
I was born in the Vail Hospital as a little preemie, like most kids born at altitude. My mom mowed the lawn in the morning, then played 9 holes of golf, and then quick delivery, I popped out. So yeah, born and raised in Vail with parents who felt like mountain parents and people, but they didn't come from the mountains. Like my dad came from Nebraska. He grew up on the farm, moved there in the early 70s. My mom grew up in Hawaii, had never even seen snow, moved there. And yeah, definitely some of the original ski bums. So they've been around for a while.
I mean, a lot of us here in Vermont think that we have mountains, and we do. There are different types of mountains, but, Middlebury is, in a unique zone. It's kind of hemmed by the Champlain Valley and the Green Mountains, but you're not in the mountains. You're kind of in farmland, essentially.
As soon as I'd come back home to the mountains where it's like expansive and open and like you could get to these high peaks and like look out in every direction, it felt so much more grounding than those like forest floors that were covered and I couldn't see my way around.
It took me a long time to come to terms with those differences and allowing myself to love both. I went to Western State Colorado University, and was so ungrounded. I almost felt like, I remember one of the early days at Crested Butte, I'm at the top of Big Chute, and I thought that God was just going to suck me into outer space. I had nothing to grab onto, nothing to hold on to, and just all this blue sky and sunlight, which is like, I'm like, what is this, a joke? 300 days of sunshine? It's almost like I didn't feel I deserved it. And I'm sure you didn't feel like you deserved 300 days of clouds when you came to Vermont.
Yeah, and I could definitely agree in that. I found value in both as well and an appreciation for both. But at that time, it was not so much the case. So coming back to what felt like home, like you mentioned, I think it did give me that respect and that newfound passion for this place that I, grew up amongst, but didn't appreciate.
And it really is different, the Vail area versus Crested Butte. It's Colorado, but it's a different world, really.
Entirely.
Much less jagged.
Yeah.
Down that way, or up that way, rather. At least close to town. So we know you Nordic ski raced, and I know, being in the ski racing world, that it's all consuming. There's not a lot of time for play outside of that in the winter months. How did you find your way into locking down your heels and ski touring and guiding? Like, when did that happen? When did you make that realization that that's what you wanted to pursue?
I mean, I'm still questioning it, so I wouldn't say I have quite nailed it down or locked it down yet, 10 years later, but the evolution all began once I left racing altogether, and I think I found this new medium, which was mountain biking. It was new to me. I had no expectations. I had no plans at that point to race, and I just did it for the fun of it. I stopped wearing a watch. I stopped using any sort of training plan, and I would just go. And it was the best summer ever because I didn't have to worry about taking a rest day. If I did take a rest day, it was okay. I mean, it took a while to come to terms with that. And sometimes I still struggle with it where I'm like, oh my God, I only have an hour to go for a run. Why even go? That's too short. You kind of get a little messed up as a Nordic skier with what you think is normal for level activity and fitness. But it was really mountain biking and getting to experience sport in this new way that then translated or transitioned to skis that next winter. And for the first time, I wanted to go into the mountains for the sake of being in the mountains. And in order to do that, I needed more than just skinny skis. So I got into backcountry skiing and cognizant of the consequences of backcountry skiing, having grown up in Vail and having heard about avalanches, and we'd go on hut trips with school, so we were introduced to it, but my parents were never supportive of helping getting me into any sort of like backcountry travel. I had some awareness about it all, and so a lot of hesitation about getting into the sport of backcountry skiing. So immediately I started with education. And, that first December, I signed up for my level 1 to get some of that education before really spending time in the backcountry. And it's always hard to know, like, do you pursue experience first and then education? Do you get that education immediately? And can it even be applied if you have no experience? But I went the education route. And in that process, I thought that by becoming a guide, then I would be fully surrounded by all these people who had that education. So yeah, in that course, I made it known that I wanted to become a heli ski guide. And still to this day, I don't know why I said that in my introduction, but I was lucky because the owners of Sawtooth Mountain Guides who were teaching my course, they heard it. And at the end of the course, they approached me and completely took me in under each of their wings in their own ways. And I got to just start spending every day out in the backcountry with both friends and then under their leadership and mentorship for 2 seasons, and continue my coursework and continue that education in Idaho. But after those 2 years, I still lacked both the confidence and the competence to fully pursue guiding, recognizing how much uncertainty there is within that career path in every realm, from, snowpack to job security. And so I actually left it altogether and spent 4 years on the road. It was 4 endless summers living purely out of a car, doing all mountain bike advocacy and mountain bike racing. And during those 4 years, I literally would dream about skiing and was always wondering about what if I would have pursued guiding. So I transitioned off of that and came to Crested Butte and decided I'd pursue it one last time with the hopes that I'd spend one winter as an intern here in Crested Butte working for Irwin Guides and be able to walk away from it altogether, but to at least give myself that winter to know why not to pursue this career that I have since pursued for the past 5 years more intensely and with greater focus.
I've read some of your writing and read, some stories with you in them. We have a nice piece about you guys touring in the San Juans last spring. You sound very intentional, and it's no surprise knowing your background. And again, the ski racing, the Middlebury type education. I mean, obviously you're driven. Was it intentional? Were you I'm going to do this mountain bike thing for 4 years? Or did you get caught out and kind of sucked in? Tell us about that time.
So that time started with a 2-year contract at that point in my life, I'd never committed to anything beyond. College was my biggest commitment. So 2 years seemed like an eternity, and it was quite challenging to make that decision. I had another incredible option where I was in Idaho, but at that point I had kind of fallen in love with my partner at the time, and he and I got the job together, and I had fallen in love with the mountains and this new sport. And the idea of getting to travel around the country was really hard to turn down. So it really did start as just this 2-year contract that was daunting at first, but as soon as we stepped into these roles, as at the time it was with the International Mountain Bike Association, and it was their trail care crew. And it had been this long standing program where everyone came in for 2 years. There's always a couple, lived out of a Subaru. Every weekend you worked with a different community on whatever trail building issues or projects they were dealing with. And so it was always on the go. We worked literally everywhere from Tennessee to South Dakota to Hawaii to Vermont, like all over the country, which was so eye-opening to me, having studied abroad and developed this appreciation for travel, having grown up in such a small town and in this complete bubble, and then gone to college in a bubble, and then raft guided. And I just kept finding these like really isolated little bubbles of ski resort towns. So travel was so eye-opening in those 2 years of living on the road and seeing. We always had this common theme of mountain biking, which, could bring just about anyone together. Every place was so unique and so different that it was really eye-opening. And my partner at the time, Jordan, and I just kind of developed this ability to live life on the go and on the road, and started to develop this community that was kind of mobile and all over the country. And so it transitioned into more of a marketing job where we worked for a clothing company called Kitspo, and it was field marketing. They gave us this like totally pimped out Sprinter van. It's kind of at the start of van life, and we were like those van lifers for 2 more years. And that didn't have a definitive contract or definitive time. It was time for us to get off of the road, and we did get off of the road. When we first moved onto the road, it was just going to be 2 years, and then it ended up doubling into those 4 years.
Was that when you moved to Crested Butte?
Yeah. So that's when I moved to Crested Butte. Ironically enough, Jordan had gone to Western, like yourself, and like most people who went to Western. He stayed for a while after. And so while we were on the road, we'd either come back to my family in Vail, which is where our storage unit was, and somewhat of our home base, but we were rarely there, or we would go to Crested Butte so we could see his community. And so I was kind of introduced to it through him. And one of the times that I was here, I was able to get on the Snowcat with Irwin Guides to volunteer for their boot packing program. And that's where I was introduced to Irwin Guides and mechanized guiding. And it was this incredible day. It was like December 15th, huge storm day. Guests were coming in. And as I learned later, it was the owners. So it was really important to open as much terrain as possible. And rather than having to boot pack the terrain where normally you just walk down all of the runs to penetrate our weak layer that always persists here in Colorado, we got to just ski. And it was an amazing powder, but a really reactive day. And so the lead guides that day, every run we touched, they were ski cutting and triggering avalanches. It was the recent storm snow. So quite manageable, but to me, I'd never been around so much avalanche activity in what felt like a controlled way. And so I was really enticed and curious about that program. And that really is what inspired my move back to Crested Butte, was to get experience working with avalanches as opposed to avoiding them.
From what I know, that snowpack is, talk about a training ground. If you can make it work there, you can make it work anywhere. And when I started touring in Colorado, we didn't even have beacons. Not that they didn't exist. I'm not that old, but like we couldn't afford them. And, maybe you rented them from the WP, but chances are you didn't have enough money to do that, maybe enough money for gas. And, it's staggering to think today because, as you know, that pack can take the most experienced of us.
Yeah.
And you've had that experience that's been close to you. And yet you still do it. You're still at it. And what allows you to keep going and challenging yourself in that way and bringing clients out into the mountains there?
I ponder this a lot. And even this year, after spending a lot of time in Alaska last year, I'm like, why? And a little time in Washington, being in these places that have or can have more of a maritime snowpack and greater stability. I'm like, why am I here in Colorado where it's petrifying to live with a persistent slab problem for an entire winter sometimes, and not to get sucked into these cultural norms around risk tolerance where it's hard to have that discipline to not step out when all the ingredients are there for the problem, but we just don't always have that avalanche problem. So sometimes we get stuck in this negative feedback cycle where one might think that they're doing it right, but they're just getting lucky. And yeah, so I ask myself why and how, and I think I just take it day by day currently, but it's also such a way of life for me. I can't imagine having been able to walk away from it entirely. And who knows, maybe one day I will. But for now, it's still where I feel like the most centered and the most myself and the most inspired. And it's where it feels the most natural to connect with people. And so it has its challenges for sure. It keeps me up at night at times. I'm still dealing with all of the repercussions of losing someone in avalanche accident. And, now knowing the reality of when things go wrong, how wrong they can go. And rather than being an optimist, which is typically how I live my life, sometimes I get paralyzed by that worst case scenario now, and I can't get my head out of that. And I think that's both beneficial to my guiding, but also debilitating at times. So, I still have a lot to work through and a lot that I'm working on, but I guess my answer would be that I can't imagine not having it. And to me, it still is one of the more important things, and one of the things that, as much joy as it sucked from my life, it's still like one of the most joyous spaces I can find.
I think those of us that ski tour a lot, it's a powerful thing, right? It's hard not to use a cliche here, but balance on that tightrope, I guess. The risk is always there, whether it's the snowpack or something else, especially when you're getting into more expedition type stuff. The environment is dangerous, and that's the draw, and the consequences can be unimaginable or very imaginable if you've been through it. With regard to your guiding, let's bring it back to where you started. That first class you took with Sawtooth Mountain Guides, and you had this interest in heli guiding. What were you walking into as a woman, and did you know you were walking into it?
Oh, that's a great question. I've never thought of that moment. I think I was really lucky because what I walked into in that course was a female instructor, Sarah Lundy. She was teaching alongside Eric, which this is so terrible that I'm spacing on his name right now. Lydecker.
Lydecker,
Sarah
yes.
Lundy was working
total recall.
Eric Lydecker. Yeah, two tremendously talented guides. And so for the first time, I was seeing a female in a position that, flash forward a year, 2 years, 3 years, I wasn't seeing females in that role. So in this very first interaction with formal avalanche education, I was lucky enough to have a female instructor and a really dialed, talented, well-educated, and highly experienced one, which, in retrospect, I think was really powerful. And I think it's probably what gave me the desire to want to pursue it, seeing her in that role. I think right away made it feel a little more feasible. But when I look at the larger picture, I didn't know exactly what a guide did. I didn't have all these like preconceived notions of guides because I'd never been guided. I didn't grow up with any connection to guides. Like I knew what a ski instructor was and a ski patroller growing up in Vail, but like I just didn't have much familiarity with guides, and it was never something I like dreamed about becoming or knew anything about. So I was lucky to have Sarah right away, but again, looking at this group of guides that I was starting to become exposed to, there were no others. And I think it wasn't super helpful in me being able to believe I could actually pursue that path because I wasn't seeing other women in that path. And granted, my scope was limited. I didn't have much exposure. I'd say it was a bit of a struggle for sure.
Do you think if you'd had that exposure early on, beyond that particular experience, that you would have perhaps pursued it? Would we have lost those 4 years of traveling and living in your Subaru and mountain biking almost exclusively, or did that contribute to that? I mean, I guess you can't probably even answer that because you don't know. In journalism, we hear it all the time, especially today, the efforts that we make to try to be more inclusive and to show different ethnicities within the pages, either bylines or photographs, etc. It really has, I think, more of an impact than we ever would have thought, especially as your typical outdoor industry, white male. What I'm hearing is, yeah, absolutely.
Entirely. And I don't think it started with that first introduction to avalanche education or backcountry experience. For me, it started as a child and having these ingrained self-limiting thoughts that continue to hold me back and continue to be something I've been working on addressing. But I think from such a young age, I don't know what it was with my surroundings, with my upbringing, with the media. Like, I wouldn't be able to pinpoint it because I did grow up with a lot of opportunity. I grew up, being able to try a lot of things and do all sorts of sports and have strong mentors, whether it was through education, whether it was through Nordic skiing, whatever it might have been. But even so, I felt like there was a limit as to what a woman could do. And then, I would put myself into these situations very unintentionally. I would have never, ever imagined having worked in such male-dominant industries, whether it is ski guiding or mountain biking. Like, mountain biking was no better, showing up to teach people how to build sustainable trails when every single dude in the room is like, what is this tiny little chick, especially back then when I'm like 100 pounds and 5'2" and just like, I don't look like your average trail builder, or like I can offer them any sort of expertise. And so every field I've worked in since graduating from college has been a field where I'm surrounded by men and white men. And here I am, like, not looking the part at all. I don't know how I ever got there and how I ever developed those like self-limiting thoughts that I think come with being, for me, female, come with being the only dark-skinned person in my private school. All these things that shouldn't have affected me, but they have.
Well, we all live with a capacity to be self-limiting, and we all create these mechanisms to work against that. I think about myself and the things I do to trick myself into driving harder and to raising the ceiling higher. And it almost seems like you're fighting that in the best way possible because, what you're doing is, you're challenging yourself every day. You're pushing yourself up against that ceiling. Have you ever thought of it in that way? Like, this is how you cope with that maybe hardwired self-limiting stuff, which I again is, I don't think there's anything gender about that. I mean, certainly there's externalities that women face that men do not, no question, but we can all have that. And I wonder how much ski racing allowed you to push through those boundaries that you might have thought you had.
Absolutely. Whether it's ski racing, whether it's, pushing through those boundaries, that's so much of what entices me about sport, whether it's on a mountain bike, whether it's on a trail run, whether it's skinning. There's nothing better than pushing past strictly physical boundaries where you don't think your body can handle it. And I know so much of it is your mind, but you push through these points of pure depletion and you come out somehow with more energy. And then you totally crash again and you just keep moving. And then you make it through and you have the energy to just keep moving again. And then you like that, for one, has always been so something I've been drawn to with endurance for sure. But then, yes, I think intellectually speaking, that is something that's very enticing about this path that I'm on with guiding and trying to be a professional in the snow and avalanche world, is that there is always more to learn. And the more you learn and the more competent you become, the further you can like take those boundaries and push past those boundaries. And like you're saying, yeah, I do think it on a deeper level then helps with those self-limiting thoughts and all of that.
When you're out with your clients on like a ski tour, say, maybe not cat skiing, but like on a ski tour, and you know, you have a range of abilities perhaps, what are some of your secrets, if you will, to helping these folks get the most out of their day?
I think my only secret weapon is having an ability to develop a rapport with people. And when every other part of me is telling me like, stop this career, there's so many reasons why not to, it is that connection that I'm able to develop with people that when they have all these mixed abilities or mixed interests or whatever it might be, getting to actually know someone and develop some level of trust with them and some common ground to understand what their needs and desires are and then to do my best to meet them. It's just this incredibly rewarding experience for me, but I think it also provides a decent experience for the guests. And that's one thing that comes like a little more naturally to me. And I have no idea why or how or what, but I'd say that'd be like, if I could think of one secret to managing that, it's really just trying to set that foundation on like a human level with everyone who I can that I get to work with.
Yeah, finding those folks where they are.
Entirely. And I think part of it, you know, was coming in from so down low, like being that unpaid intern. You're just sent the most either trying of clients or like the most beginners that, you know, have shown up for a day of work. And it's not necessarily the glorious side of guiding where you're like crushing epic pow or, you know, on some like really technical route. Instead, my introduction into this world was working with like never ever skiers or whatever it was. And so I think from early on, I had to develop these skills to, for one, gain their trust, which again, as a female, a small female, someone of color, I'm going to have to do with everyone anyways that I come across in my field of work. But having to do that with these people who are super timid and intimidated by so many aspects of like what they may have hired you to take them on, maybe against their will or they were up for it, really set this foundation that I was able to build off of as I started to, you know, get to move up in the world of guiding and take on guests with greater abilities and whatnot. Really knowing the importance of meeting guests with where they're at and not trying to make it about you as the guide, which I've seen plenty of.
I'm sure you have. You've got your work, which, you know, we've talked about a little bit, and then you've got your own personal skiing, and you've done a ton of travel for both. This summer you were in Chile, you were in Mexico. That was more on a mountain bike mission. I know many of the, the girls, especially that you've ski toured with that have made it into Backcountry Magazine or like Girl Crush, your film project from the Tetons. How do you find that balance? Are you like shoulder season person where you're locked in all winter and then you get to play once the guiding season is over? Is it just that simple? I mean, having been a snow pro
Yeah.
myself, I know how that kind of works.
Oh, my managers would love me if it was that simple, but no. And I would love it if it was that simple, because shoulder season obviously is when there's less guiding. So it'd be a great time to fill it with side projects, but inevitably cool opportunities always seem to come up like right in the heart of guiding season in the summer, the winter. And then I'm trying to ask for time off and I'm not nailing the balance at all. Working on it, not nailing it. But in an ideal world, I've tried to put as much of that into the shoulder seasons. They just tend to blend together. But I have found, against the advice of some and feedback of others, I just find the balance, not the balance, I find the two pursuits to be so complementary of one another, even if it leads to some sleepless nights because I'm pulling all-nighters trying to fit it all in, or I'm stressed thinking about how am I going to fit this all together. In the end, once somehow the pieces all fall into place, it always feels worth it. And it feels like the experiences that are gained in either that like creative work or the individual ski pursuits or mountain bike pursuits or the guiding efforts, like they all kind of fit together and build off of each other. And I think by pursuing the different avenues, it makes each little project or it keeps things interesting for me by like having a lot on the table,
Again, pushing up against that ceiling, right?
Yeah. It keeps it stimulating. It pushes up on that ceiling for sure.
Have you ever thought, when it comes to like these projects, and we should tell the listeners what these projects are. I mean, you're going out with, from my perspective, you're going out with some photographers and some, and you're a pro skier.
That might be too generous of a term.
Well, but you're doing some really cool projects with some really cool people. And obviously that's tough to line up. Forget about your jobs. You get 4 people trying to go on an expedition in March, like it's tough to put together without any other encumbrances. But have you ever thought about what it might be like to live near an airport, for instance? like Crested Butte is not an easy place to pop out of, as it were.
Yeah, it'd probably save me days of trying to find that cheapest airline ticket that still makes sense without, having insane layovers and whatnot. But I've yet to highly consider that move.
Are you jealous of your friends in Jackson and Salt Lake City?
No.
Good answer. Crested Butte is such a special place, and that's the trade-off, right? You're isolated, but you're also isolated.
Exactly.
So tell me, Lani, about this upcoming winter. You guys are off to a great start in Crested Butte. Are you guiding already?
I haven't guided any guests, but we are doing a lot of guide training, and then starting this weekend, we will be on. So, yeah.
Great. What else is potential for the winter?
Interestingly enough, I think some of my biggest takeaways from this past year, where I just said yes to everything and then worked so hard to create quite a few opportunities. I was so booked out, and to the point where I wasn't able to either appreciate an experience to the level that I would have liked, or be present enough for it, or prepared enough for it. I just spread myself a bit too thin. That for this winter, I'm really trying to do my best to stay put and focus my energy a bit more deliberately on fewer things. So what that's looking like is staying closer to home, being here in Crested Butte, guiding for Irwin, teaching some avalanche courses. I will get to go up to Japan and guide some guests for part of January, which will be both fun and work. And then come spring, things are up in the air. I have quite a few ideas. I'm just not sure what exactly will manifest. Some is contingent on work, but largely speaking, I really do hope to, over the course of at least 3 months, gain some sort of a routine to be a bit more grounded, to ideally leave myself a day or two off a week and be able to ski for fun this winter, a day or two a week. And then, yeah, come spring, I do have some ideas to get into some bigger mountains and continuing to develop my technical skills and ski for fun and all of that. But
do you have like a bucket list? Do you have any like dream trips that are like kind of out there, or is it just about, are you at a place where it's just like, what's coming at you? What can I jump onto? How do you look at it that way? I struggle with that. Like, and I don't know if it's an age thing or just a reality thing or all of the above, and maybe it's a luxury to have a bucket list. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't really have a bucket list. What I find is that each year I tend to be drawn to like one or two places. And I don't know where that inspiration comes from, but in looking back on the past few years, those places always, with the exception of the pandemic, I somehow end up in those places. And I'm often asking myself, like, wait, how did I even dream this up? And how did I even get here? But like this past year, specifically South America was that enticing place. And then somehow I had the opportunity to go down there and tail guide in Chile for their spring, our fall. This year, my inspiration is really tied to the Alps for some reason. And so I'm hoping that will come into fruition. Actually, last year, Alaska was also one of those places that was really on my mind. And I was able to spend the whole spring up there, getting experience doing like a base camp expedition on a glacier, and then taking my advanced ski guide course with the AMGA in Valdez, and like just getting around Alaska, which was really eye-opening to me. So yeah, I definitely don't have a bucket list. Sometimes opportunities seem to be thrown my way, but more often than not, it's me dreaming it up and then scheming and then working with companies that I have good relationships with and trying to create the opportunity.
I love it. Sounds quite familiar.
Yeah, I wish it was just like, ooh, come to Greenland. I'm like, all right, yeah, I'll be there.
Seems like, and it's like you have to have like 5 or 6 things in the hopper and one of them's going to come off maybe.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something I actually have found as I've started to write a little bit more and dabble in the film world. One of my favorite things is the pitching cycle. When all the publications reach out and they're like, all right, time to submit your pitch, because that's when I actually do the deep dive and start reading and like go down these deep wormholes in places I had never even heard about, or learning more about like issues, or I mean, I'm all over the map with what I end up finding interesting. But I feel like working through that whole pitching process, even if nothing gets green light for a season, it's then on the back burner for, that next year, or when that place might become an opportunity to go and visit, to like do that deep dive back into the whole pitching process, a cycle of things that I've thought about and researched in the past, and, being able to bring them into whatever does become an opportunity down the road. And so, yeah, that's definitely a process I love and enjoy working through.
Well, it tickles me to hear that you love that process, because it's a lovely process. You get to dream, like you're making your wish list and you're doing that research. And it's not unlike, pursuing any kind of trip, but when there's something about like, will somebody bite, and will this make it possible for me to go? Because then I can get the support and I mean, it's how we've all worked it over the years. So I'm glad the next generation is Picking up the mantle there.
Yeah, though there are times where I'm like, why do I always have to tie it to something to like gain that support to be able to do it? I wonder what it'd be like to just have the means to go do the thing without any deliverables. But at the end of the day, I find so much value in, I don't know, almost having a purpose and having something to be more present for, to ask more questions, to document, to then like come home and you have to sit down and reflect on it and process it and then find something to share. Like that, it's everything from that pitching cycle to actually doing the thing and trying to glean as much as you can from whatever that thing is to then, eventually sharing it. And it's a process I stumble through and fumble through, and it takes me so much longer than it takes someone like yourself or like a true professional, who does that all the time. But I find so much value in it. I can't quite move away from it yet.
I'm not sure that it gets easier with more experience, because I can say when it comes to travel, when you're going on an adventure, you can kind of set the intention, if you will, and make the pitch. I've never had the pitch match up with the reality ever. Yeah. And that's okay. And it's a little weird because then you kind of feel like you're a bullshitter. Like the pitch is kind of maybe, you're making some stuff up. And it's not because you're trying to be not transparent, but it's just you just don't know. So you have to kind of wing it a little bit, unless there's like a central figure to the piece. But it sounds very familiar to me because there's something about doing this stuff in our skiing world with intention, and I think that's part of being a career kind of skier. Is so many of my friends have like those jobs you were talking about when we first started, right? The college jobs, the well-paying college jobs. They can kind of go on vacation and their intention is to just do whatever they want. Mm-hmm. But I haven't had that experience. It's always had to be on somebody else's nickel a little bit. Mm-hmm. There's something special about that too, I think.
Absolutely. Both sides of the coin have extreme value.
What drives you? What makes you get out of bed every day and live this very busy life?
It's a great question that I should have an answer to, but I think a lot of what drives me is this desire for growth on a lot of different levels. Like definitely growth on a personal level, in recognizing how much there is to both learn, to experience, to do, to converse about. I'm very driven by that. And, being able to grow on an individual level, I think that growth also applies on a bigger level, like within a community, within another being, within society. And I don't have like this wide spread level of interest, like ability to reach people, all of those things. But within like my little network, I think there's a desire for that same growth to, be achieved or addressed or sought after with those who I'm surrounded by as well. Yeah, so I think that's a lot of what drives me, is just always trying to learn and grow and be better and do better. I don't know. I think I just came out of the womb ready to like live. People sometimes are like, life's so hard. And trust me, I get that. Like I get really bogged down. There's some days I really can't figure out like how to like set up the day, and I'm like all jumbled and, I just strike out. But largely speaking, I am just so drawn to life and like living it. And I just want to fit it all in, and it's overwhelming, I want to go for all of those skis. I want to like get to the top of every peak and like have these really powerful, meaning conversations with friends, with new people to learn. And so I think that just drives me. Like I'm so I so genuinely love getting out to ski or to ride bikes or to go to yoga or to like meet up with a friend or to sit down and write and really use my brain or whatever it is that, yeah, I just kind of wake up with it and with a lot of energy that needs to be burned. And yeah, I guess those things kind of drive me.
I think they do. It's really a pleasure, Lani, to hear about how you interface with the world that I am so in love with and have been for so long. We all have our different take on things, and it's just cool. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Howie. I really enjoyed talking with you about all of this.
Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Backcountry Podcast and for supporting independent media. And one more shout out to our friends at Taos Ski Valley for sponsoring this episode. Here's a quick word from Taos.
Support comes from Taos Ski Valley, committed to protecting people, place, and planet so that its ecosystem and spirit can be preserved for generations to come. Learn more at skitaos.com.
The Backcountry Podcast is produced by Backcountry Magazine, an imprint of Height of Land Publications in Jeffersonville, Vermont. Backcountry's small but mighty staff works hard to bring you stories that are beautifully produced, thoughtfully edited, and thoroughly fact-checked. Betsy Monero is our editor-in-chief. Mike Horn is our podcast producer and engineer. Our music was composed by Alex Paul. Please consider supporting independent journalism by subscribing at backcountrymagazine.com. Use code PODCAST for 10% off your entire order. I'm Adam Howard. Thanks for listening. Until next time, we'll see you in the backcountry.